Welcome everyone to day 3 of the Geneva Health Forum. We have already managed to tackle so many topics over the past couple of days, and I hope that each and every one of you were able to take away at least a few things or two and also manage to squeeze in some yoga sessions in there. Now we are down to our final day of the forum, and we're going to start the discussion by looking at decolonising global health. My colleague Ariana Corta will be helping us and guiding us throughout this discussion. I'd like to welcome her now and let her take it away from here.
Thank you so much, Olivia.
Thank you.
So as Olivia was mentioning, this discussion aims to identify imbalances in power exercised by Western individuals and organizations on global public health. The increased attention to institutional racism has given a greater sense of urgency to this conversation. I'm here moderating together with Mishal Khan, joining us from London. Mishal is a Pakistani expert in health policy and systems, who is also an associate professor at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and Aga Khan University in Pakistan. I will be now removing my mask since I will be presenting by myself in the rest of the session. Good morning, Mishal.
Hi, good morning, and welcome everyone. So, as you mentioned, this is going to be an engaging discussion, and as you said, there's been a lot of discussions and a lot of statements made about moving ahead on shifting the power dynamics and reducing some of the racial and national hierarchies that exist in global health. And when I was asked to moderate this session, the first thing that I thought is, well, it's great to have discussions, but we really need to start talking about moving from statements to reform, because talk is easier than change, especially when so many of the challenges are really deep rooted. So if you'll allow me, Ariane, I thought, since there's going to be quite a diverse audience, I might start by just describing getting everyone up on the same page to say, well, what is the problem we're discussing, and why do we think things need to change? I've got a couple of slides, which could those be shared? Brilliant, thank you. So just to frame the discussion before we bring in the others, what is global health? The definition, and then I'm not going to be, there's papers and papers about this, but just for people to know about the polarization in the way that global health could be described. So one way that very much focuses on the goodness and the equity of global health is an area of work that places a priority on improving health and achieving health equity for all people worldwide. Then on the other sort of extreme of the spectrum, it could be described as a branding, a term used to brand work that enables the concentration of power and expertise in the West, and to really justify institutions in Western countries or the global North to dominate. And so it's important to bear in mind that both of these definitions and a whole range between them are floating around, and what we think global health is really aiming to do. The diagram that I have up on the slide is really to emphasize that we might disagree on what the definition of global health is, but I think it's pretty clear that there's a Europe and USA sort of geographical dominance of everything from public health or global health journals, where academic institutions are based, NGO headquarters, where conferences are running from, we're at the Geneva Health Forum, we're very conscious that we're playing into some of these dynamics. And then so within that, the idea of decolonization is the freeing from dominance, the independence, and it's not just economic, but it's also cultural, educational, and psychological. So that's sort of a framing of why we're here. And I have one next slide, please. just to illustrate, I have a second slide, please, just to illustrate. Yes, thank you very much. How these issues, this is my attempt to sort of say how these issues are interconnected. So people from low and middle income countries find there's greater barriers, even when the work and the individual is at the same standard. There's barriers for various metrics of what is considered expertise. So that includes being published journals, winning funding, being able to access a degree from a top public health school, all of these things which are sort of stamps and brand you as being really an expert. And separately, even when you have those stamps, it's still harder to end up in a leadership position in a global health organization. And then I'm going to reference some of the work of Global Health 50/50, which examined the makeup of leaders of global health organizations. And because of these dynamics, what we see as outcomes is that only 17% of leaders are from low and middle income countries, as compared to 50% being from the US and the UK. And if we look at degrees, where global health leaders get their degrees from, only 8% are from low and middle income countries, which is the same as the percentage of degrees from a single university, Harvard. So that's just to frame the issue. And I've got some brilliant expert panelists with me, so I will stop here.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Indeed, we have very interesting panelists.
I'll tell him when he starts speaking
that Emmanuel Capobianco, Director for the Health and Care in the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. We also have Seya Abimola, editor of a leading global health research journal, BMJ Global Health. He could not make it today, but sent the video recordings of the interviews. Sarah Hawkes, professor of global public health at the University College of London and co-founder of Global Health 50/50, an independent research and advocacy organization that has revealed major inequities in leadership of global health organizations. Tamam Aloudat, senior strategy advisor for the Médecins Sans Frontières Access Campaign. Thank you so much for joining us today. So now, Michelle, I'll leave you to ask the very first question.
Yes, thanks. So thank you all for joining. And I wanted to go straight into the issue of incentives for reform and whether they exist and what they are. So Tamam, do you mind? Could I ask you to start with sharing some of your thoughts about incentives for reforming the system?
Yes, thank you very much, Michelle. The question is interesting, and I'm very happy that we are going to move from theorizing to proposing incentives, actually. However, I just want to say one thing. You have used the literature and the mostly agreed definition with the caveats you mentioned about global health. And I think we give it too much benefit of the doubt if we use the best possible definition. We could argue at least that the global health as it stands now is a set of norms that allocate resources and that is controlled by power hierarchies that can aim as much towards perpetuating their own power as towards improving health across boundaries. And that moving away from an exclusive benevolent definition and into one that considers the power dynamic is probably an important step towards understanding the decolonization idea. And I'll move towards the incentives. And it's nice that we are looking for incentives for power actors to give up some of their powers, but we also have to talk about the disincentives, because rarely has any colonial power in history, in the old classic colonialism, given up its position of power willingly because it was incentivized by the kindness of their hearts. So we will accept that there are increasing, in some quarters at least, willingness to have equity and equal control of our collective destiny when it comes to people's health. But that is always going to be a concept that is fragile, especially as we see populist politics and money still control almost every aspect of us and our global health. So let's talk about the incentives first. If we are talking about the part where actually health is delivered to people in the most vulnerable areas, and as we are approaching more global emergencies as the COVID is, what I mean here is the almost inevitable now consequences of climate change. There is an incentive to actually be able to deliver aid effectively, both for people to be better off as a result of that, but also because those powers that are now controlling that allocation of resources do not want people to go to be unhealthier than they need to, sorry to be honest, but to stay in their place. Because if people are desperate enough and discriminated against enough, they will start demanding stuff, and it'll stop being about incentives then. So the incentives is a sustainable health provision that takes into consideration the complexity of the situation, that is not log framed and planned from Western capitals, that is not underestimating the complexity of people, their specific cultural norms and their health needs, and that allows them to make a significant part of the decision on their resource allocation. And I just want to make one distinction. By allowing people to be in a prominent place, it doesn't automatically translate into allowing Southern organizations to be in a driving place. This is an important shift in power, but if it stops there, we are liable to see the same power dynamics replicate themselves over time. There has to be a way for patients, for communities to decide what matters to them and how are the resources that are spent in their names go towards that end.
Wow, thank you.
Thank
That's really broad but concise at the same time. We had, as Erin had mentioned, we don't have say in person, but his answer to the same question. So maybe we can flick to that next before we bring in the other panelists.
What I think of as incentive or disincentive for reform actually is one and the same thing. I think that we can't begin to talk about reform without understanding very clearly what is at stake. In other words, having a very clear idea of what reform looks like, of what decolonized global health looks like, is both an incentive, frankly, and a disincentive for reform. But it's an inevitable starting point. And I don't think we are there yet. There's a lot of discussion about what is wrong with the system. There's a lot of discussion about perhaps what needs to change. But we are not as yet clear about what that change looks like, what a decolonized landscape of global health looks like. And I think getting clarity and some kind of consensus and collective understanding on what that change looks like is an incentive to reform, certainly because you can galvanize energies behind certain clearly defined goals. But it's also a disincentive because, frankly, undoing the colonial settings in global health means repositioning entities that are currently central, putting them on the periphery, and moving entities that are today peripheral to the center. And sometimes even those entities don't exist yet. But having the imagination to will them into being and place them centrally, I think is an important step that we have to think about and take seriously in our efforts to decolonize global health. And of course, we all know, I mean, there's no denying the fact that people who have power are often unwilling to let go of them. But again, being very clear about what powers need to be let go of and what change looks like is a good starting point. And just to make it a bit concrete, you can imagine what it would look like for the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, for example, to become a marginal player in global health. What will it take for the London School to turn itself into a marginal player in global health? What would it take for the Lancet as a journal, or the British Medical Journal as a journal, or any other central entity that currently occupies a lot of central place in global health? What will it take them to turn themselves into peripheral entities and what steps do they need to take to get there. And that's not easy for anyone. But a good place to begin is to imagine what that world looks like and take concrete steps to get to that world. Does it mean, for example, that London School starts to de-emphasize itself in some way? Does it mean that it starts to decentralize the training that it gives to students in London, move it to particular locations around the world? Does it mean that it starts to move its grant funding away from itself and into certain kinds of locations around the world? I mean, there has to be a clear idea of what those concrete steps are. Otherwise, we can't even begin to have a discussion about incentives and disincentives. We have to have a clear sense of what future we are working towards.
Well, I think what Say was mentioning, it was incredibly interesting, right? About bringing clarity to the concept of decolonizing global health in order to have meaningful actions, right? So that brings me to our next question about carefully framing the case for decolonizing global health to attract all of the stakeholders. And I mean that we need to include potential opponents as well. So what is the best way of making an argument for decolonizing global health? I would like to ask, I would say we can go with Tamam.
Okay, I realized that I was a bit vague in the beginning. Let's talk about some specifics before the argument. If we are to shift the power, I completely agree that we need to conceptualize a global health system that is decolonized. Now, the second question is, how do we reach that conception of a global health that is decolonized without falling into checking some checkboxes of we have enough, people of color in leadership positions? It is absolutely important, but it's not a guarantee. So there are a few things that are obviously wrong with the global health system. There are northern organizations that are run by Westerners that mostly come from a pretty narrow cultural and ethical and moral values background that runs the whole global system and allocates billions and billions of dollars towards the health of people in the South. Representation is important. And I'm not talking about tokenism, I'm talking about actively guaranteeing that there are people from communities and countries in all levels of organizations and from all kinds of backgrounds. And to be careful here, it wouldn't work to have people of color or people from the South who are fully assimilated to the European way of life be part of that as the token people of color. We need to be able to accept that leadership will take multiple shapes. Not all of them look like the CEOs and directors of now. The second one is about education. We are still stuck in, if you do not have a master's degree from an acknowledged leading school, and the four of us on this panel are from a single school, and there is a bias towards London School because it gives you that rubber stamp of acceptance and used to be almost a guarantee of a job. There's a reason for that. This school makes someone like me pay 4 times in admission fees than someone who is European or British. That is obviously a bias. And the fact that someone has to go to London when it is not the easiest thing in the world for many of us to go to London and live there and get the admission to live there is a bias. When we talk about exchange and production of knowledge that will feed global health, it is concentrated in a narrow set of people and organizations. Today, we have actors in global health who have gained their place. Well, let's talk examples. Bill Gates can publish an editorial in The Lancet or BMJ or New England Journal or the New York Times with probably 5 minutes notice about any topic in global health that he can think about. Very few people in the global South, no matter what their skills or decades of experience or lived experience, can dream of something like that. All those are obvious. We're not even talking about the structural issues. We're not talking about overcoming the historical barriers. We're talking about stuff that are comically obvious. that need to be changed.
Also like to bring Sarah to this question. I wanted to know if she had some insight on this same question, Sarah. So it's how do we frame the case for of decolonizing global health so that we can get all of the stakeholders, including the opponents?
Yeah, thank you. I was sitting here listening to this really rich and invigorating discussion so far, and thinking, okay, the problem with asking me as an academic is I'm obviously going to have to focus on the question of what do we mean by global health, and then what do we mean by decolonization before we start to agree on a pathway to where we're all trying to get to. And I don't want to spend 3 minutes talking about definitions, but I do think the question of what we mean by global health is actually a really good starting point. We've heard a lot of discussion. Certainly, there's been a lot written about the nature of global health as defined and held, where power is held within certain knowledge-based institutions, for example, or certain financial institutions. But I think one of the things that really characterizes the global health system is its vast complexity. I suspect that if you asked not just the four of us on this panel, but anybody working in the global health system to define what they meant by the global health system, you would have additional actors being added all the time. So you heard a little bit of data from the work that we do in Global Health 50/50 from Michelle. That was data about the characteristics of the leadership. So that's 200 organizations within the global health system, none of which are actually those knowledge-based academic institutions, but include, for example, the vast private sector that has an enormous role to play in influencing what health policy looks like at both global and national levels. So, if you actually look at those 200 organizations, we're not only talking about organizations that clearly have a health mandate, but an enormous range of stakeholders that are playing some kind of role in the global health system, for good or bad, it may be said. So I think perhaps how do you decolonize global health? Perhaps it's a good place to start to actually think about, can we agree on a set of institutions and a set of structures and a set of norms that we are trying to change? So I don't have a very succinct answer to the question of how do you frame this for the global health system, because the system is so complex and so vast. But I'd just like to bring in something of what we've learned from the decades of feminist experience for gender equality, which is that there's no single framing that was. So going back to the notion of the private sector, I'm not when I look at issues around gender equality in the corporate sector, I'm not talking about private healthcare providers. I'm talking about the big transnational corporations, for example, that have a really important role to play in the direction of health policy, particularly in relation to commercial products. They're not going to necessarily be motivated by calls for social justice. They are going to be motivated by calls for effectiveness. So, what's worked to some extent in calls for gender equality is showing that the lack of diversity, not just in leadership, and I'm very clear on this, not just in leadership, but throughout the workforce, is that becomes an ineffective workforce and leadership. Whereas I can imagine that for some of us on this panel, we're more motivated by a goal of social justice. We want to see a world that rights historical wrongs, that recognizes and rights those historical wrongs. So I think, a bit like what is global health, there's no single answer to that. There's no single answer to the framing question. But it's very clear that we can make change happen once we understand what it is that we're trying to change and with whom. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. As a with a policy analyst hat on, I find this discussion really, really interesting. But I think, as you point out, we all bring in our own biases, even when we're advocating for global health. Emanuele, I wondered if you wanted to add your thoughts on how should we be making the case for this change.
From a Red Cross perspective, we see three priorities. We are pushing for three priorities globally. First is really the agenda of localization, and is pushing for local actors to be central to everything about health in the humanitarian development space, and that goes from setting the agenda to implementing to making sure that monitoring evaluation happens and local actors are at the centers. And what we should be having is international institutions that are supportive of that central role. And we know that in the humanitarian field, since the World Humanitarian Summit in 2015, we know that only 2% of the financing is going to local actors. And so a shift there is absolutely needed. We as a Red Cross have 192 national societies. We are very much a local organization, and we have seen this new agenda of localization not really taking off as fast as it should. Maybe with COVID, because of number of international organizations have been physically being blocked from acting and from moving, we may see finally this localization moving in the right direction. A second point I wanted to bring that we are very passionate about is the concept of universal health coverage. Decolonizing global health is also breaking away from oppressive ways of thinking, and I believe that universal health coverage provides a platform that is truly universal, that really brings the issue of access to healthcare in an equal foot, be it in access to HIV services in Malawi or access to an intensive care unit bed in Switzerland when all the beds are full. And so it's also showing how the global south, and again, I think about the COVID response, is leading the response, while the global north, who is currently facing such a massive wave in the US and in Europe, has a lot to learn from the global south. And breaking that paradigm of where the expertise is just as important. And my third point that comes from the localization agenda and from the universal health coverage is the empowerment of communities, which is not a tokenistic element, is really at the core of global public health, is ensuring that communities are fully empowered and leading the actions to improve the health activities, the health outcomes in their own communities, and that starts from positioning the organization closer to those communities, within those communities. We as a Red Cross have the volunteers who are within those communities. Many other organizations don't, and that is a leap, a jump that needs to be made. And having mechanisms to understand what communities need, what communities think, what communities want in terms of support, and let them drive the planning, the response of programs and the research. Since we are talking also with academic institutions, involving very much into the research, because the effectiveness at the end is the effectiveness for the human beings that are affected and are within the communities. The effectiveness is at that level, and I think we need to shift more and more towards that end point, which is absolutely critical for everyone.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel. You know, we had some great conversations while we were preparing this session, and we also got some questions on Twitter. And most of them really kept asking about how to bring in voices of people who are unable to attend conferences like these. So this is exactly why Michelle had sourced our questions today from global health folks around the world.
Hi, my name is Afifa Rahman Shepherd. I currently work at the Centre for Universal Health at Chatham House. Thank you so much to the panel for the opportunity to ask a question. My question is about the levers of change to really redistribute power in global health. Is it about targeting change at an individual level and looking at those who currently hold disproportionate power in global health decision making? Or should we be focusing our efforts on systemic change? Thank you.
Since we've got more questions to get through, I thought maybe we can, instead of having all the panelists, just see if one of us wants to take and see if others jump in. Sarah, not to put you on the spot, but do you want to try and take that one?
Oh yeah, no, I could speak for hours, but I'll be really quick. I'm so clear in my own mind that this is about systemic change. That you know, the people at the top are a representative of a system that needs changing. I don't think it's particularly useful necessarily to point fingers at individual leaders and expect them to lean in or out without changing the system that they're leaning in or out to. And as you might gather, I'm not particularly fond of the notion that we all need to lean in without the system changing. And I think, again, you know, I can really just draw on my experience of years of feminist activism that at the end of the day, I think it's really clear to anybody as old as me that just, for example, putting a woman in charge does not lead to a feminist system. That feminist systems, and I would hazard a guess that decolonised systems, are not led by single individuals. They are led, as we've heard, also from the bottom up. So I'm absolutely clear that we need systemic change.
Brilliant, thank you. We had another. Yeah, Tom, did you want to? Did you put your hand up? Did you want to?
Yes. I wanted to thank Professor Hawkes for clarifying at least a word about the lean in and lean out, because there is a real risk of a lean in anti-colonialism, which reflects when we talk about some people changing in principle and some people changing in terms of efficiency, we tread a line, I fear, with the lean in feminism that doesn't necessarily fall positively on all of us. I agree that the system needs to change. But the question is, can the systems change when the whole leadership are exactly what is the descriptor of the whole system? And, you know, is it enough to say that we will change the system when everybody who has power to initiate and sustain the system change is still in their place? So I agree that the system comes above individuals, but I don't see the system changing without a significant look at who the individuals that carry the keys to its change are.
Yeah, please go ahead, Emmanuel.
Yeah. Also, I agree on the need to structural changes and systemic changes, and those are the ones that then are more permanent. But those are based on changes that are also interpersonal and are very much linked to individuals. And what I think we need is open dialogue around those issues that have been in the closet for a long time, an open dialogue that actually allows the hurt, the pain to be understood, to a dialogue that allows individuals also to uncover their own biases and work with those. And I think that is something that institutions need to bring into their own, allowing for that dialogue to happen. And I think it's a moment where this is happening. Is happening here at this forum, but is happening in research institution and organizations, needs to be encouraged, because that concept of diversity needs to be, as Sarah was saying, permeating not only the leadership, and not shouldn't be tokenistic, should be truly integral to any organization, and linked. And again, that's what Sarah mentioned, to that effectiveness principle that for many organizations is sometimes the driving fact. I think more diverse organizations are going to be more effective organizations, and we need to open a dialogue to make that happen faster than the speed that we have had until now.
Yeah. Okay. And I'm going to move, just because we've got three more questions to cover, and they're each as sort of explosive. So the next topic that came up a lot was about power. And we had some great questions about that. And we have another recording from Pakistan on that.
Hi everyone, this is Kamran Beg, public health practitioner from Pakistan. Thank you so much, Michal, for giving me this opportunity. So my question is pretty straightforward, and I would like to know the panel's perspective on the composition of power in global health. What constitutes power? Is it the institution, the economy, the experience, the expertise, the funding, or the intersection of all these factors? So what needs to be redistributed to strike a balance in power in global health? Thank you.
And I'm going to throw in another. We had a question come in from on Twitter from Emmanuel Agogo from Nigeria, who also raised the topic of whether is it a zero-sum game? Was his question? If someone is losing power and someone's gaining power, how does that play out? And I'm also sharing one that's on the screen now that came in through Twitter, which links back to the discussions we were having about how do we change what's incentivized and considered a marker of success. So the question is, how do we incentivize impact on the ground versus impact of the manuscript? This came in from Munira Rashid. So there's a couple of questions, one about power, zero-sum game, and changing what we're incentivizing in terms of success as a global health outcome. So should we kick off on that? Tamam, did you wanna start? I see
yes.
you writing.
Yes. I think the power question is absolutely important. What is the power in the global health system? And it's obviously a financial power. And this is where the concept of localization faces a huge challenge, because a localization that is driven by Western organizations who still allocate the resources and sign the checks is going to be difficult to consider a true shift in power. So financing is a huge power. And that's why we see the biggest finance organizations in the global health arena are the biggest power players as well. The other one is understanding that the global health isn't an apolitical discipline. Many of us in the humanitarian sector try to maintain our neutrality or assert our neutrality and impartiality. And that would be lovely as long as it's practicable. But the global health system isn't apolitical. It is deeply political, and it's deeply guided by the politics of those who control it. Hence, we have seen a certain administrations pulling out of WHO changes the whole global scene. We have looked at 2 vaccines announced last week that might have efficacy, significant efficacy in COVID-19. 80% of one of them and 85% of the other production until the end of 2021 is already purchased before they hit the market. And the rest isn't going to. So we talk about allocation. Those are bought and spent already. And as long as there isn't a serious engagement in how politics affects global health and to what end. And as long as we keep pretending that the playing ground is level and the slate is clean, then we would struggle. So this finding ways to sort of try to democratize the allocation of resources and to try to engage people and communities and decision makers, but from the global south, but also from the poorest sections in the global north, in making the political decisions about the allocation of resources. And then just to say a word about the zero-sum game. It is a zero-sum game if we consider that the power is finite and the needs are finite, that the organizations that are functioning now are doing everything that can be done to improve people's health across boundaries. And then whatever we take in terms of decision-making powers away from them is reduced from their plate. And that is delusional. Neither are the needs finite, nor are the ability to expand global health interventions finite. And there is plenty of work for everybody to participate in a democratic and exchanging way. It just requires us to start arguing for that global health system that loosens the grip of today's powerful and accept a flatter and more benevolently political global health system.
Thank you so much.
Want to come in on that?
Well, I would like to now follow up with Emmanuel. What does Emmanuel think about this? What does he think about power and about the zero-sum game that you were mentioning? And afterwards, we'll just show the Twitter question again because maybe right now we've just forgotten, and we'll keep going with that with Sarah. So, Emmanuel, what do you think about that aspect of power in decolonizing global health?
I see two important elements on the power discussion. One is about who sets the agenda, and the other one is who directs the money for that agenda to be implemented. And what I would argue is that agenda needs to be set as close as possible to the communities, and that is the challenge that needs to happen. And there are organizations that are more structured than others to ensure that the agenda is set at that level. And let me just mention, we as a Red Cross, of course, we are auxiliary to government, so we work very much at the national level with governments to set the agendas together. If I look at one of the global health institutions, the Global Fund, it has created over the past 20 years a country coordination mechanism that actually define what the focus for the financing should be. And so the ownership of that is through a mechanism in country that is very much comprehensive and bringing a lot of different actors at the table. And again, what is important then is that those actors that are local actors are represented in governance structure at the global level, and that to me is what is essential to ensure that where financing is decided, we do have a representation of communities that are affected by the diseases, by local organizations that are on the ground, and again, tokenistic approaches, really meaningful approaches. And I think some of institutions have, maybe the most recent one, have a better governance structure than others are older. And so for me, there is a need to review the governance structure to ensure that the participation is very much reflective of and incorporates the voices and the needs that come from the ground.
Thank you so much, Emmanuel. Can we please share the Twitter question just once more so that I can invite Sarah to answer that one? So how do we incentivize impact on the ground versus impact of the manuscript?
Oh, it's a good question. So, I mean, I think that there's probably a number of ways of thinking about thinking about what the questioner is trying to get at, which I imagine is how do we put knowledge into action. And I think that I think we probably understand a little bit more about how to incentivize the people writing the manuscripts to ensure that they participate in the systems of implementation and the systems of action than we understand about the incentives of the people making political decisions to use evidence. So I think that that like everything, there are two sides to this particular question and coin. So for researchers, I think there are very clear and somewhat effective mechanisms to ensure that researchers actually don't just spend their lives publishing papers. The academic system has clear incentives in it in some countries to ensure that impact is not just measured by the impact of the journal that you publish in, but is also measured by real world impact on the ground. There are very clear systems of incentivization and career progression, for example, within several academic systems that do that. I think what we understand a lot less, except in a sort of rather simplistic way, is the notion of why people, particularly in political circles, don't use the evidence that's in front of them. And I think that unless we start to really question why we have ended up in 2020 in a position where those people with political power, who are not necessarily the same people as those with financial power, because I think that would come back to the question of what do we mean by power, but how we've ended up in a situation where very powerful political stakeholders are seen as anti-evidence and anti-science. I think that deserves as much reflection as how you incentivize researchers and manuscript writers to have an impact on the ground.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Michelle, do you have any final questions for them regarding the audience?
Yes, so we had a final question come in on Twitter, which is about accountability, and I think that's a good one to start. The final 10-15 minutes of the session.
Thank you for this much needed discussion. I have two questions today. The first is, how do you hold organizations like the WHO and MSF as well as the donors accountable? And the second is, how do you suggest they bring about a paradigm shift in the workplace?
So I think that's a good opportunity for us to start reflecting on what can be done in each of our organizations. And we've got an answer from Say on that too, but perhaps because the question mentions MSF as well, I don't know, Tamam, if you want to start by reflecting on what organizations that we all work in can do.
Okay.
What steps can global health journals take to shift power dynamics and reform the system? Well, I think the first thing to think about here is a commitment to a process of redefinition of purpose. Right, the global health journals need to be clear about what they are there to do. And again, it's another issue in my view that we're not clear about in global health. What is the purpose of global health journals? Again, because we can't think about decolonizing global health. We can't think about journals shifting power dynamics without being clear about what the purpose of global health journals is, and we are not yet clear about that. For me, at the moment, global health journals occupy far too much space in the knowledge ecosystem. And I would like to see a commitment to thinking through alternatives. And I wish that would be a collective process among academics who do global health, both in sort of high-income countries, but also in low-income countries. And also by academic journals themselves and their publishers to reposition themselves as smaller players in global health. And to seek out and strengthen and facilitate and support alternative platforms for knowledge exchange that are much closer to the ground, much closer to where global health actually happens on the ground. And platforms that help to connect systems, health systems, social systems better with themselves. Because if you think about what global health journals do, sort of the ones that are big and central, they often serve a purpose, in my view, of sort of academic exchange among academics who are often distant from the field of activity. And if we want to think of a future that we are trying to get to decolonizing global health, it would require those central journals clearly defining what their purpose is and what they should be doing, and clearly defining what it is that they should not be doing, and working very hard to stop doing the things that they should not be doing. And again, that takes a lot of imagination, it takes a lot of work, but also takes a lot of collective coming together to make that process happen in a broad way, so that it's not just one journal or two journals trying to do this, but a lot of the sort of critical mass of people committed to making this kind of change happen.
If Saya is watching this taping at later in the day, I would just like to say thank you. Thank you for sending your answers in advance. Indeed makes this conversation even more rich. So to start finishing up a little bit, this fascinating but complex discussion has brought new perspectives on how healthcare is situated according to global needs. Michelle, as a professional in the field yourself, and after hearing the comments today, what actions should we take moving forward?
Yeah, and sorry, Samam, I know we cut you off, but this is moving into the last 10 minutes, which is all about how can we and our organizations make change. And what I really heard today, just to summarize some of the most thought-provoking things that I'd heard, is that part of what we need to acknowledge is that global health isn't all good and fuzzy, and that it's nuanced, and that actually, if we acknowledge that there is a concentration of power, and part of what the system is designed to do is perpetuate some of the same power dynamics. If we acknowledge that, then we can start thinking about framing it in a way that's not naive to assume that everybody's on board and everybody cares purely about social justice. And I think reflecting, Sarah, on some of the feminist experiences you had really is important there. The other really important point I'd heard was about the fact that although the system needs to be changed, the system isn't separate from the leaders. So it's not just about individual change and tokenism, but we can't be naive and assume that the people that hold power will proactively change the system if they are people that represent a certain mindset or have potentially benefited from some of the power dynamics that then we're now asking them to change. So I think those are some of the key take-homes for me about sort of being more cognizant, and as Say mentioned, being very clear on imagining what sort of new global health world we'd like to see, and then looking into organizations and asking them, what are you going to do? What steps are you going to take as an organization to become closer to that, perhaps including making yourself less relevant or more peripheral. So, with that, I think I would turn over to the panelists. So, what can organizations that you work in, or organizations in your sector, if you don't want to be very specific, do to shift the power dynamics? And sorry, Tamam, to cut you off. So I'm going to start with you.
The obvious caveat is that this discussion is still in a very early stage. It is quite active in MSF, but I will not talk on the behalf of the organization because we do not have an organizational position yet on it. The points, I think, are first, the achievable things is move the power and decision making away from centers that are explicitly sitting in the ex-colonial powers and make it more close and hence accessible to people who have different cultural and experiential backgrounds. And that is one can happen by physically moving or by insistently achieving more representation at every level from the South. And I think, to respond to Sarah's truly very inspiring comparison to the feminist movement. Obviously, having 50% or gender parity doesn't guarantee much. We remember Mrs. Thatcher saying she doesn't put women in her cabinet because they're incapable of governing. But it is a step. It normalizes the presence of people like who aren't all, the typical, stereotype of leadership or practice. And the other, so that representation has to happen. And today we are in a better place to do the representation because it doesn't need to get, work permits, and people do not need to sit in the European headquarters. We can have a workforce everywhere. We have, if there is a silver lining to COVID, is that it has proven beyond doubt that organizations can function without central offices that cost millions and are a magnificent barrier to access of others. The other thing is, there was a mention of paradigm shift in the workplace. And I think there is a separate aspect to what is being called out as structural racism in Western organizations and in global health and humanitarian organizations. It's not exactly the same discussion, but they overlap quite a bit. And some of the sources of that, othering some of our staffs and the assumption that they are, by definition, less competent, less experienced, while glorifying people from other backgrounds and giving them much easier access, is going to affect the predominant culture. The last thing I want to say is we keep hearing about the values of our organizations. And those are usually good values in general. The humanitarian principles, the values that carried humanitarianism and global health, are good principles, but they are interpreted over time by Western perspective, a Western cultural perspective that has asserted them and explained them long ago, and they become scripture and they stop being subject to different interpretations. And I think if we are going to go beyond this fuzzy, let's have a culture change thingy, we need to talk about transculturation that accepts that the old values will merge with the new cultural interference and become something entirely new that might not look like us as we are now, but it'll probably be better suited for a future where we all function together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tamam. We only have less than 2 minutes left, but I do want to get everybody, involved. So let's start with you, Sarah. What do you think should be changed or should be implemented in organizations treating global health, to decolonize it, I mean?
So I think that there's a whole raft of interventions and policies and practices that need to be changed within each organisation. I think, to come back to a previous question, we do have systems of accountability, not necessarily always fully functioning, but we can hold systems to account, either at the leadership level or both at the leadership level and at the level of the workforce. I think that there's actually a lot that can be done within each individual organisation that makes up part of the global. I think where I'd like to finish, though, is just recognising that the global health system doesn't exist alone. The global health system exists within an incredibly imperialist economic system today. And until we start to actually tackle imperialist economics, we can decolonize global health, but we will not right the injustices and inequalities of current economic systems unless we start to really think very broadly and politically about what determines health and well-being for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now, Emmanuel, if you can name just one thing that you could change or implement specifically in the Red Cross, which is your area of expertise, what would it be?
Well, I think I go back to a point that I mentioned before, that we need to have an internal dialogue around this within institutions, around the diversity and the needs for greater representation geographically, gender, and also from a cultural, academic, professional backgrounds. We are going to gain from that dialogue, and that dialogue will hopefully create an environment for a more diverse leadership to emerge. And for me, that diverse leadership is something that we should be all continuing advocating for. And if I can add just last point, ensuring then the accountability element that has been coming out, the accountability mechanisms are strengthened, not only for leadership, for the organizations, particularly re-looking at the governance, which is for me is a critical element, but also internally and making sure that we do have a mechanism to ensure that the dialogue happens and that people are free to speak and are free to be heard and can actually drive the change from within. In this specific point, ombudspersons are critical within the organization, should be strengthened and the mechanism made as functional as possible within each organization. So I'll stop here, but thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much to our speakers, to our my co-moderator, Michelle, and of course to all of you for watching and bearing with us today in this invigorating and such a rich discussion. So up next, don't miss the lessons from the field discussion about humanitarian work during times of a climate and environmental crisis.